I am Ethan, I am 29 years old, and exactly 12 years ago, my parents packed up our entire house, loaded their lives into a moving truck, and moved 2 states away without saying a single word to me. They did this while I was working a minimum wage evening shift at a local grocery store. When I came home, they left me an empty, echoing living room and a single yellow post-it note stuck to the kitchen counter that read, "You'll figure it out." While I was freezing in a rented, concrete storage unit, eating out of a jar of generic peanut butter just to survive my senior year of high school, they were telling the rest of our extended family that I had stolen their life savings and run away. They smeared my name at every Thanksgiving dinner, every family reunion, and every neighborhood block party, portraying themselves as the heartbroken, suffering victims of a delinquent, ungrateful son. But there is one thing they did not know. They did not know I would keep the single piece of evidence that proved they committed a massive financial crime against me. A crime involving a massive college fund and inheritance left behind by my late grandmother. And now, after seeing my face on the cover of a prominent business magazine, they are begging to be part of the empire they actively tried to destroy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their lies in front of half the city and brought them to their knees, hit that like button if you believe karma always collects its debts. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the day my childhood abruptly and violently ended. I remember the exact sound my key made turning in the front door lock that afternoon. It was a bleak Tuesday in late November. I was 17 years old, wearing a stiff polyester uniform that smelled permanently of floor wax, bleached floors, and rotting produce from the grocery store where I worked after school. I was exhausted. My feet ached in my cheap sneakers, and all I wanted was to grab a hot pocket from the freezer and crash on the sofa. I pushed the front door open, expecting the usual chaotic sounds of my household. I expected to hear my mother's daytime talk shows blaring from the television. I expected to hear my older brother, Oliver, shouting at his video games in the den. I expected my father to yell at me to take out the trash the second I walked through the door. Instead, there was nothing, just a hollow, echoing silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that immediately tells your brain something is terribly wrong. I walked into the living room. The floral couch was gone. The heavy oak coffee table was gone. The television, the rugs, the framed family photos on the mantel. Everything was gone. The only things left were the pale dust outlines on the hardwood floor where the furniture used to sit. Panic began to claw at my throat. I ran down the hallway to my parents' master bedroom. Empty. The closet doors were wide open, stripped of every hanger, every piece of clothing, every shoebox. I ran to Oliver's room. Empty. Even his posters had been peeled off the walls, leaving behind little squares of torn drywall. I felt my chest tighten. My lungs suddenly refused to pull in air. I stumbled backward into the kitchen, my work boots squeaking on the linoleum, trying to make sense of an impossible situation. Was it a robbery? But robbers do not take family photo albums and old winter coats. And that was when I saw it. Sitting alone on the bare kitchen island was a single bright yellow square of paper. I walked over to it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. It was my mother's distinct, looping handwriting in blue ink, for words that would be burned into my retinas for the rest of my life. "You'll figure it out." I did not scream. I did not cry right away. My teenage brain simply could not process the absolute, calculated cruelty of it. I slowly slid down the kitchen cabinets until I was sitting on the freezing floor. As the sun went down and the house grew completely dark and freezing cold, the horrific reality settled into my bones. My family had not just left. They had meticulously planned their escape. They had quietly boxed up their lives, hired a moving truck, coordinated their schedules, and driven away, all while I was bagging groceries for minimum wage. They had looked me in the eye that morning, knowing they would never see me again, and they said absolutely nothing. Fast forward 12 years. The freezing kitchen floor is a distant memory. I am standing in a massive corner office on the 40th floor of a luxury commercial real estate building in downtown Chicago. I am the CEO and founder of a tech consulting firm that I built entirely from scratch with my own two hands. I have a salary that would make my old high school guidance counselor choke on his coffee. I have a robust 401k, a beautiful penthouse apartment, and a life that is secure, ordered, and peaceful. I fought through hell to get here, and I finally felt safe. Then the tranquility shattered. My custom-built computer chimed. An email notification popped up in the bottom right corner of my monitor. The sender's name made my blood run instantly cold. Susan. My mother. For a long moment, I just stared at the name. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing the panic of that 17-year-old boy. I took a deep breath, clicked the mouse, and opened the message. It was incredibly brief, entirely devoid of any warmth or remorse. Ethan, we saw the feature article about your company in the Business Journal. We are so incredibly proud of the man you have become. You are still our son, and family belongs together. Let's put the past behind us and meet. I read it 3 times. There was no apology for abandoning a minor. There was no explanation for the 12 years of absolute, deafening silence. There was no inquiry about how I survived, if I went hungry, or if I even graduated high school. Just a casual, entitled invitation, written as if we had simply lost touch over a busy summer vacation. They saw my success. They saw the valuation of my company. They thought they could just waltz back into the empire I bled to build and claim their seat at the table. They said they wanted to reconnect, but I knew exactly why they were suddenly reaching out right now. And that is when the storm truly began. To truly understand the absolute audacity of that email, you need to understand what happened in the weeks and months after they left that yellow note. 3 days after I found the empty house, the landlord showed up. When he found out my parents had broken the lease, stopped paying rent, and skipped town, he did not offer me sympathy. He gave me exactly 48 hours to vacate the property, or he would call the police and have me arrested for trespassing. I had no legal rights. I was a minor. I packed what little clothes they had left me, mostly threadbare t-shirts and worn-out jeans, into 3 black plastic garbage bags. I walked out of my childhood home and never looked back. For the first week, I couch-surfed. I rotated between the homes of a few high school friends, but you can only sleep on someone's floor for so long before their parents start asking uncomfortable questions. When I ran out of friends who were willing to hide me, I took my very last grocery store paycheck and rented a windowless, concrete storage unit on the industrial edge of town. That became my home. The winter hit hard that year. I slept on a pile of discarded winter coats I found at a thrift store. I would wake up at dawn, my breath pluming in the freezing air of the metal box, and sneak into the local YMCA. I used their facilities to shower, shave, and brush my teeth, so I would not smell like a homeless teenager when I sat in my high school classrooms. My diet consisted entirely of generic brand peanut butter eaten with a plastic spoon, tap water from public fountains, and whatever leftover bruised fruit they let me take home from the grocery store. Every single night, as the freezing wind rattled the corrugated metal door of my storage unit, I played my parents' words over and over in my head. My father used to look at me across the dinner table, his eyes full of contempt, and call me a useless burden. He would say I was a drain on his finances. Meanwhile, my older brother Oliver was the undisputed golden child. When Oliver turned 16, my father bought him a brand new car with a red bow on it. When I turned 16, my father handed me a toolbox and told me it was my job to fix the leaky roof before winter. Oliver got expensive sports gear, private tutors, and endless praise. I was the one expected to scrub the floors, mow the lawn, and keep my mouth shut. The only saving grace I found in those dark, desperate days came from a woman named Sarah. Sarah owned a small, 24-hour diner a few blocks away from my storage facility. I used to go in there late at night just to sit in a warm booth, order a 50-cent black coffee, and do my homework under the fluorescent lights. I tried to be invisible, but one freezing Tuesday night, Sarah noticed I was violently shivering. She noticed how my clothes hung off my malnourished frame. She did not ask invasive questions. She did not call child services. She simply walked over to my booth, took my coffee cup away, and set down a massive, steaming plate of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and thick brown gravy. She slid a job application across the table, tapped it with her pen, and told me to show up for the dishwashing shift the next day after school. She paid me under the table in cash so I could eat. Sarah gave me dignity when my own blood relatives threw me away like garbage. She was the mother I actually needed. She saved my life. Thinking about Sarah's kindness made me look back at the email from my biological mother on my computer screen. A wave of disgust washed over me. I moved my mouse and deleted the email. I sent it straight to the trash bin. I was not going to play their twisted game. But a week later, another email arrived. This one was from Oliver. "Ethan, I miss you. Please, can we just talk? Can we fix this? I am coming to Chicago next Thursday for a sales conference. Just one coffee. Please give me a chance to explain." I stared at the screen for a long time. Oliver was the golden child, yes, but he was also just a kid when they left. He was 19 in his first year of college. Part of me, the broken, lonely 17-year-old part that still lived deep inside my chest, wondered if Oliver was a victim too. Maybe they manipulated him. Maybe they forced him to leave. I replied with a time and the address of a busy, upscale coffee shop right across the street from my office building. When I walked into the cafe on Thursday afternoon, I recognized him immediately. He looked older, slightly heavier around the middle, dressed in a mid-range, off-the-rack suit that looked a little desperate compared to the tailored clothing of the financial district crowd. He stood up nervously, awkwardly extending his arms to initiate a hug. I kept my hands firmly in my pockets and offered a curt nod. We sat down across from each other. Oliver immediately launched into a heavily rehearsed script. He pushed a paper napkin to his eyes, wiping away tears that did not quite seem to fall. "Ethan, I am so incredibly sorry," Oliver said, his voice cracking. "I was just a stupid kid. Mom and Dad told me you wanted to stay behind. They told me you had a solid plan to live with a friend's family so you could finish your senior year at your own high school. I did not know you were out on the streets. I swear to you on my life, Ethan, I did not know they left you with nothing." I sat perfectly still. I watched his face, analyzing every micro-expression. I let the silence stretch out, making him squirm uncomfortably in his leather chair. 12 years, Oliver," I finally said, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. "In 12 long years, you never once picked up a phone. You never once sent a letter to my old high school. You never once tried to find out if I was dead or alive." Oliver leaned forward, lowering his voice, looking around as if someone might overhear us. "That is not true. I swear, Ethan. I thought about you every single day. I worried about you constantly. I even found your LinkedIn profile about 5 years ago. I saw that you were living in Chicago and starting your own consulting business. I was so proud of you, man. I really was." He stopped talking, waiting for me to smile, waiting for absolution. But the damage was already done. He had just handed me the rope to hang his entire argument. "You found my LinkedIn 5 years ago?" I asked slowly, leaning back in my chair, keeping my eyes locked on his. Oliver blinked, realizing his fatal mistake a second too late. "Well, yes, but you didn't message me," I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave. "You knew exactly where I was. You knew what city I lived in, what company I ran, and that I was alive. You were 24 years old. You were a grown man with a job and a life. Why didn't you reach out then?" Oliver looked down at his half-empty coffee mug. His jaw tightened. The facade of the heartbroken brother melted away, leaving only raw, selfish cowardice. "Mom and Dad, they still help me out financially, Ethan," he mumbled, refusing to make eye contact. "They still pay for my housing. They help cover my car lease. If they found out I contacted you behind their backs, they would have cut me off entirely. You know how Dad gets. He would have ruined my life. I couldn't risk my lifestyle." There it was, the absolute, unvarnished, disgusting truth. He had known I was alive, and he knew I was building a company from the ground up, but keeping his monthly allowance and his lease car was vastly more important than checking on his homeless brother. I stood up from the table, buttoning my suit jacket. I did not shout. I did not make a scene. I looked down at the man who shared my DNA and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just pity. "Have a safe flight back home, Oliver," I said, dropping a crisp $20 bill on the table for my coffee. I turned and walked out the door into the bitter Chicago wind, knowing that this was not a family reunion. It was a reconnaissance mission. They were testing the waters, and I had just shown them I was not the same naive kid they abandoned. I thought the worst was over. I thought walking away would be the end of it. I was so incredibly wrong. 2 days after my deeply disappointing meeting with Oliver, the real barrage began. The reconnaissance mission was over. They were now declaring open warfare. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a quarterly financial report when my personal cell phone buzzed. It was an unknown number from out of state. Against my better judgment, I answered it. "Ethan? It's Mom." Susan's voice trembled through the speaker, dripping with that practiced, theatrical sorrow she always used to get her way at the neighborhood HOA meetings or church bake sales. "Oliver called us. He told us you walked out on him at the coffee shop. Ethan, why are you being so cruel and heartless? We are your family. We love you. You lost the right to use the word family 12 years ago." I replied, my voice hard. "Do not call this number again." Before I could hang up, there was a scuffling sound on the line, and my father snatched the phone. Robert's voice was loud, aggressive, and incredibly demanding, exactly the tone that used to make me cower in my bedroom as a child. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," Robert barked. "We raised you. We put clothes on your back for 17 years. You owe us for that. We are facing some extreme financial hardships right now. Your brother Oliver's son, your nephew, needs emergency surgery, and our health insurance will not cover it. You are sitting in a glass tower making millions. You owe your family. Transfer $50,000 to our bank account by Friday, or I will personally come down to Chicago and teach you some respect in front of your employees." I ended the call immediately and blocked the number. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from pure, unadulterated rage. They were using a phantom surgery for a nephew I had never even met to extort money from me. They thought they could bully me just like they did when I was a helpless teenager. I immediately picked up my office phone and called down to the lobby. I asked to speak to Brenda, the head of building security. Brenda was a tough, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who treated the building like her personal fortress. I gave Brenda a detailed physical description of both my parents. I gave her explicit, unwavering instructions. If anyone matching those descriptions showed up at the building, they were not to be let past the lobby doors under any circumstances. If they caused a scene, she was authorized to call the police immediately. That Friday, I was in the middle of a highly sensitive board meeting with potential investors when my executive assistant, Maria, walked into the conference room. She looked pale and visibly shaken. She bypassed everyone and handed me a folded note. It read, "Your parents are in the lobby. Your mother is lying on the floor. They are calling an ambulance." I calmly excused myself from the investors, walked into my private office, and pulled up the building's live security camera feed on my monitor. Down in the pristine marble lobby of my luxury high-rise, it was absolute chaos. Susan was lying flat on her back on the polished stone floor, clutching her chest, her eyes squeezed shut in agony. It was a spectacular performance. Robert was standing over her, screaming at Brenda and the other security guards, demanding they let him up the elevators to my penthouse office because his wife was dying from a broken heart caused by their vicious, negligent son. I stood there watching the screen, my expression cold. I did not go down. I watched as the paramedics rushed through the revolving glass doors with a stretcher. I watched them kneel beside my mother, check her vitals, hook her up to an EKG machine, and look extremely confused when they found absolutely nothing wrong with her heart rate, blood pressure, or oxygen levels. It was a textbook panic attack completely manufactured for an audience. They loaded her onto the stretcher anyway to transport her to the hospital for observation. As they wheeled her out, Robert stopped, turned around, and glared directly at the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. He pointed a single, threatening finger directly at the lens. He knew I was watching. That evening, I poured myself a heavy glass of expensive bourbon and stood by my floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering Chicago skyline. The silence of my apartment felt heavy. Then my phone rang again. This time, caller ID showed it was my Uncle Mark. Mark was the only relative I still occasionally communicated with. He was my father's younger brother. Over the years, I sent him a Christmas card and occasionally answered his text messages because I genuinely believed he had nothing to do with my parents' betrayal. I thought he was innocent. I answered the call. "Ethan, my boy," Mark said, his voice smooth, warm, and diplomatic as always. "I heard about the terrible misunderstanding in your lobby today. Your mother is in the hospital, Ethan. She is very distressed. Your father is beside himself. She faked a heart attack to bypass my security and cause a scene, Mark," I said, taking a sip of bourbon. "They tried to extort $50,000 from me." "Listen to me, Ethan," Mark continued, his tone subtly shifting into something slightly more sinister, losing its warm edge. "You are a highly successful CEO now. You have a corporate reputation to uphold. Your company's brand is built on trust and integrity. It would look absolutely terrible for your corporate image if a story leaked to the press about you abandoning your sick, elderly parents out in the cold. Just give them the money, Ethan. Protect your brand. It is just the cost of doing business." I froze. My blood ran cold. That was not a request from a concerned uncle. That was a thinly veiled threat of corporate blackmail. I hung up the phone without another word. The betrayal cut deep. The web was bigger than I thought. The next night, I had to attend a high-profile industry networking gala at a luxury hotel downtown. It was a mandatory appearance to secure a massive merger I was planning for the next quarter. I was standing near the open bar, trying to keep a low profile, when Sophia approached me. Sophia was the CEO of a rival tech consulting firm. She was a ruthless, quiet businesswoman who had been actively trying to undercut my business for 2 years. She wore a stunning red designer dress and held her champagne glass delicately by the stem. She had a wicked, knowing smile on her face. "Ethan, darling," she purred, stepping into my personal space. "You look tense. I was having the most fascinating conversation the other day. Some people from out of state reached out to me. They had some very interesting, very tragic stories about your unethical family values. Stories about how you treat the people who raised you." She took a slow sip of her champagne, her eyes locking onto mine. "It would be an absolute shame if those heartbreaking stories made it to the trade publications right before your big merger next quarter. Investors hate scandals, don't they?" The pieces violently slammed into place. My parents had not just shown up randomly to throw a tantrum. They had meticulously researched my industry. They had identified my biggest competitors. They were actively conspiring with Sophia to orchestrate a massive smear campaign. They were going to destroy my livelihood, my reputation, and everything I had built if I did not pay their ransom. They were trying to hold my entire life hostage. I did not say a word to Sophia. I simply turned around, walked straight out of the gala, handed my valet ticket to the attendant, and got into my Porsche. I locked the doors, connected my phone to the Bluetooth, and dialed my lawyer, David. David was a shark. He wore tailored suits, worked 80-hour weeks, and was the kind of attorney who genuinely enjoyed dismantling people in court for sport. "David," I said, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles ached, "I need you to run a full background check, an asset search, and a complete financial history on my parents, Robert and Susan. Pull every public record, every tax lien, every real estate transaction, every bank loan from the last 15 years. Leave no stone unturned. They are trying to extort me." "Consider it done, Ethan," David replied, the excitement evident in his voice. "I will tear their lives down to the studs." I was ready for a brutal, drawn-out war. But the very next morning, a completely unexpected visitor arrived at my front door. carrying a dark secret that would change the trajectory of my entire life. I opened the heavy mahogany door to my penthouse apartment, expecting to see a courier delivering legal documents from David. Instead, I found a young woman standing in the hallway, looking utterly exhausted and terrified. She had dark bags under her eyes, her hair was disheveled, and she was holding a sleeping toddler tightly against her chest. When she shifted her weight, the sleeve of her jacket slipped up, revealing a dark, purple bruise forming aggressively on her left forearm. "Ethan?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am Chloe. I am Oliver's wife. This is your nephew, Leo." I was stunned, but I immediately stepped aside and ushered her inside. I locked the door behind her, directed her to the soft velvet sofa in my living room, and brought her a glass of cold water. Chloe looked around my expansive apartment, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the modern art on the walls, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute desperation. She took a trembling sip of water before looking back at me. "Oliver does not know I am here," she said, her hands shaking so badly the ice clinked against the glass. "I had to come. I drove straight here from the suburbs. I couldn't carry this burden anymore. Your parents, Ethan, they are monsters." I sat in the armchair across from her, keeping my voice calm and gentle so as not to wake the sleeping child. "Take your time, Chloe. Tell me exactly what happened." Chloe took a deep, shuddering breath. "For 12 years, Robert and Susan told our entire extended family, and me, that you were a severe drug addict. They said you stole $80,000 in cash from a safe in their bedroom, emptied their checking accounts, and ran away in the middle of the night to buy drugs. They cried at every family gathering. They said they spent years hiring expensive private investigators to track you down, but that you were a lost cause and didn't want to be found." My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. They had not just abandoned me to freeze in a storage unit. They had systematically assassinated my character for over a decade to justify their own horrific crimes. They made themselves the martyrs. A few weeks ago, when they saw that Feature magazine article about your consulting company, they went completely crazy, Chloe continued, wiping a tear from her cheek. "They realized you had real money. They told Oliver they were going to go to Chicago and get what you owed them. Yesterday, when I found out they went to your office building and your mother faked a medical emergency in the lobby, I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted them in my own kitchen. I told Robert the First was going to call you, tell you the truth about their lies, and apologize on behalf of the family." Chloe subconsciously reached over and touched the dark bruise on her arm. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Robert grabbed me. He squeezed my arm so hard I thought the bone would snap, and he threw me against the kitchen counter. He leaned in and told me that if I ruined their payday, he would make sure Oliver filed for divorce immediately. He said they would hire the best lawyers and take full custody of Leo, and I would never see my son again. When Oliver just stood there and said nothing to defend me, I packed a bag, grabbed my son, and drove straight here. I looked down at the sleeping toddler. My nephew, the innocent boy they used as a pawn to try and extort $50,000 for a fake surgery. A cold, absolute, terrifying fury settled deep into my chest. This was no longer just about me. This was no longer about a 17-year-old boy who was left behind. They were actively terrorizing a mother, physically assaulting a woman, and threatening a child. "You are safe here, Chloe," I said, my voice vibrating with absolute certainty. "They will never touch you or Leo again. I promise you that on my life." While Chloe and Leo slept safely in my secure guest room, my phone rang. It was Detective Hayes from the Chicago Police Department. "Mr. Ethan, we are responding to a reported break-in at your brother Oliver's residence in the suburbs. The place was completely ransacked. Drawers emptied, files destroyed. Oliver claims it was a random burglary, but several neighbors reported seeing a vehicle perfectly matching your father's car speeding away from the scene. They had broken into their own son's house to steal documents, passports, and personal items to intimidate Oliver and Chloe into staying quiet. I gave Detective Hayes my address and told him to immediately send an officer to my apartment to take Chloe's official statement regarding the physical assault and domestic violence. I was going to build a fortress around her. An hour later, my lawyer, David, walked into my apartment. He didn't bother greeting me. He walked straight into the kitchen and threw a thick, heavy manila folder onto the marble island. I pulled their financial records, just like you asked, David said, a predatory, victorious grin spreading across his face. You were right to be suspicious. Ethan, your parents didn't flee the state 12 years ago because they were broke or facing bankruptcy. They fled because they were hiding a massive, undeniable felony. I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of copies of bank statements from a high-yield trust account. When your grandmother passed away, she left a substantial college fund specifically in your name. Because you were a minor, your parents were the legal custodians of that account, David explained, aggressively pointing to a highlighted line of numbers on the paper. 2 months before they abandoned you, they forged legal documents and liquidated the entire account. Exactly $80,000. They used it to pay off illegal gambling debts your father had racked up, and used the rest to buy an investment property out of state under a shell corporation. Then, they vanished before you turned 18 and could legally demand an audit of the funds. I stared at the paperwork. The black ink on the page validated every ounce of suffering, every freezing night, every hunger pang I had endured. They had not just left me to starve. They had systematically stolen my future to fund their own reckless delusions, and then painted me to the world as the thief to cover their tracks. But that is not even the best part, David said, tapping a second document with a freshly manicured finger. Look at the notary signature on the withdrawal forms. I looked closely. The signature was sloppy, but entirely recognizable. It belonged to Uncle Mark. He had facilitated the entire fraud. He was the one who authorized the illegal transfer. That is why he called me, trying to force me to pay them off. He was protecting himself. I looked up at David, the cold, calculating reality settling in. I had the weapon. I had the irrefutable proof. And I knew exactly where and when I was going to use it. David, I said, my voice dangerously calm, devoid of any hesitation. Next Thursday is the annual charity gala for the Children's Foundation. Victor, the CEO of my biggest client, is hosting it. It is the biggest corporate event of the year. My parents know I will be there. Sophia knows I will be there. I guarantee you they will try to crash it to cause a massive public scene and force a settlement. David nodded slowly, a dark understanding lighting up his eyes. And what do you want to do when they show up at the door? We are not going to call security, I said. We are going to let them in. We are going to let them take the stage. And then, David, we are going to execute them in front of everyone. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The Monday morning of our court date arrived with a bitter, biting chill in the Chicago air, the kind of cold that seems to seep directly into your bones. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my penthouse bedroom, meticulously buttoning a charcoal gray bespoke suit. I was not dressing to impress my parents. I was dressing for war. I was dressing to project absolute, impenetrable authority. Beside me on the bed lay the thick, heavy legal binder my lawyer, David, had prepared over the weekend. It contained every piece of evidence, every police report, and every financial record we needed to secure a permanent restraining order against the people who brought me into this world. I took a deep breath, adjusting my tie. I looked at the man in the mirror. He was a long way from the terrified 17-year-old boy shivering in a concrete storage unit. Today, that boy was finally going to get his justice. I met Chloe, Oliver, and David outside the imposing stone steps of the county courthouse. The sky was an unforgiving, flat gray. Chloe looked exhausted but incredibly resolute, holding tightly to Oliver's arm. She wore a simple black dress, her posture radiating the protective ferocity of a mother who refused to let her child be weaponized. Oliver, on the other hand, looked like a man walking directly to his own execution. For his entire 27 years of life, he had been the undisputed golden child, entirely dependent on Robert and Susan's approval and financial support. Today, he was going to walk into a court of law, raise his right hand, and testify against them. "Are you ready for this, Oliver?" David asked, his voice sharp and unsentimental, cutting through the morning wind. "Once we step through those doors, there is no going back. If they try to corner you, you do not speak to them. You let me do the talking. We are establishing an airtight legal boundary today." Oliver swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He looked at Chloe, then at me. "I am ready. I have to protect my family. I can't let him threaten Chloe with a custody battle ever again." We walked through the heavy metal detectors and took our seats on the hard wooden benches in the hallway outside the courtroom. The air smelled of stale coffee, anxiety, and harsh lemon floor polish. It was a scent that instantly dragged me back to my teenage years, scrubbing floors at the grocery store while my family was busy packing up their lives to abandon me. 15 minutes later, the elevator doors at the end of the hall chimed loudly. They walked out. Robert and Susan strode down the hallway with an air of absolute, sickening entitlement. My mother was wearing a conservative, expensive-looking navy dress, clutching a designer handbag in one hand and a tissue in the other, already preparing her props for her victim performance. My father walked with his chest puffed out, an arrogant, dismissive smirk playing on his lips. Following closely behind them was Uncle Mark, playing the role of the concerned, supportive family patriarch. They did not have a lawyer with them. Robert's ego was so incredibly massive he genuinely believed he could simply walk into a courtroom, sweet-talk a judge into forcing a family reconciliation, and guilt-trip me into dropping the case to avoid public embarrassment. When my father's eyes locked onto mine from across the hall, he did not look ashamed. He looked furious. He glared at Chloe, silently promising her a vicious, drawn-out divorce process and a living hell, just like he had threatened in her kitchen. But when his eyes landed on David, the shark-like attorney standing casually by my side with a predatory smile, I saw a brief, undeniable flicker of uncertainty cross Robert's face. The heavy wooden doors opened, and the bailiff called our case. We filed into the courtroom. The wood-paneled room was dead silent, save for the clicking of the court reporter's keyboard. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a stern jawline. She looked over her reading glasses at my parents, then down at the extensive, meticulously tabbed file David had submitted to the clerk. Robert stood up immediately, not waiting to be acknowledged. He rested his hands on the defense table, leaning forward as if he were addressing a room full of his subordinate employees. "Your Honor," Robert began, his voice booming with fake warmth and practiced charisma. "This entire proceeding is a massive misunderstanding. It is simply a family squabble blown entirely out of proportion by my youngest son. We love our boys. We are simply trying to reconnect with Ethan after a very long, tragic estrangement. We haven't broken any laws. My wife has a fragile heart condition, and the stress these boys are putting her through is absolutely unconscionable." The judge stared at him for a long, painfully quiet moment. She did not blink. "Mr. Robert, you will sit down," the judge commanded, her voice cracking through the room like a whip. "You will speak when spoken to. And according to the certified medical records subpoenaed from the paramedics who treated your wife in the lobby of the plaintiff's building last week, her heart condition is entirely non-existent. You orchestrated a fraudulent medical emergency to bypass private security and harass the plaintiff at his place of business." Susan let out a dramatic, muffled sob into her tissue, shaking her shoulders to make sure everyone saw her distress. 12 years ago, that performance would have made me feel immensely guilty. Today, it just made me sick to my stomach. David stood up smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, we are requesting a strict, multi-year restraining order protecting my client, Ethan, as well as his sister-in-law Chloe and her minor child, Leo. We have submitted time-stamped security footage of the defendants aggressively trespassing. We have submitted photographic evidence of the physical bruising left on Chloe's arm after Robert physically assaulted her in her own home. And we have police reports documenting a forced entry break-in at Oliver and Chloe's residence, where the defendants stole personal identification documents in a blatant attempt at witness intimidation. The judge turned her piercing gaze to Oliver, who was sitting rigidly next to Chloe. "Sir, you are the biological son of the defendants. Are you testifying under oath that you feel your wife and child are in physical danger from your own parents?" Oliver stood up. His hands were shaking so violently, he had to grip the edge of the heavy wooden table to steady his body. He looked across the aisle at the people who had raised him. Robert was staring daggers at him, his face twisted in silent rage, silently mouthing the word, "Don't." Susan was holding her breath, waiting for the golden child to protect them like he always did. "Yes, Your Honor," Oliver said. His voice cracked on the first syllable, but then he took a deep breath, and he found his strength. "They broke into my home. My father physically assaulted my wife because she threatened to expose their lies to my brother. They have used money, guilt, and fear to control me my entire life. I am terrified of what they will do next to my son." The silence in the courtroom was absolute and deafening. The golden child had just completely shattered the illusion. The perfect family facade was broken forever. The judge didn't need to hear another word. She looked at Robert and Susan with pure disgust. She picked up her wooden gavel and slammed it down with a sharp, final crack. "Based on the overwhelming evidence of harassment, the documented physical assault, and the pattern of extreme intimidation, I am granting a full 3-year restraining order," the judge declared. "Robert and Susan, you are to remain 500 feet away from Ethan, Oliver, Chloe, and the minor child at all times. You are prohibited from contacting them directly, electronically, or through any third parties. If you violate this order in any capacity, you will be immediately arrested and jailed without bail. We are adjourned." My parents looked absolutely stunned. The color completely drained from Robert's face, leaving him looking pale and old. They had never, not once in their privileged lives, faced real legal consequences for their actions. As we walked out of the courtroom and back into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hallway, Uncle Mark tried to approach me. He raised his hands in a placating, diplomatic gesture, his face twisted in a forced smile. "Ethan, please be reasonable. This is a disaster for the family reputation. You don't want this on the public record?" "Mark," David interrupted, stepping cleanly and aggressively between us. "If you take one single step toward my client, I will personally call the bailiff and have you arrested right here in this hallway for violating the third-party contact clause of the order we just secured. Back off." Mark went pale, swallowed hard, and scurried back to stand behind my parents. We had won the battle. We had the legal protection. But as I watched my father glare at me from down the hall, his eyes burning with humiliated rage, I knew the war was far from over. Restraining orders are just pieces of paper to narcissists who believe the rules of society do not apply to them. I knew my father's massive ego could not handle being publicly humiliated and legally bound by the son he viewed as garbage. I knew he was going to retaliate, and I knew exactly how he was going to do it. Thursday night was the annual charity gala for the Children's Foundation. It was the most prestigious, exclusive corporate event of the year in Chicago. Every major CEO, real estate developer, and tech mogul in the Midwest would be there, including Victor, the billionaire CEO of my firm's largest client account. Victor had been a mentor to me for years, practically the surrogate father I never had. My parents knew all about the gala because it had been heavily publicized in the business journals. Sophia, my bitter corporate rival, also knew I would be there. I had a gut feeling, a cold, unwavering certainty in my bones, that Sophia had reached out to my parents immediately after the court ruling. I knew they were plotting to crash the event. They thought if they ambushed me in front of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the city, if they screamed about how ungrateful and cruel I was to my poor, sick mother, I would fold under the pressure. They thought I would write them a massive check just to make the public embarrassment stop and protect my corporate salary and business reputation. They thought they were walking into my worst nightmare. But in reality, they were walking blindly into a meticulously designed trap. I sat in my penthouse living room with David late that Wednesday night, finalizing the plan over a glass of bourbon. We had the manila folder. We had the certified bank records. We had the irrefutable, undeniable proof of the felony they committed 12 years ago. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this, Ethan?" David asked, sipping his drink, his eyes scanning the documents. "If we execute this publicly, it is going to be explosive. The press will cover it. Your personal life, the abandonment, everything will be front-page news. It will be messy. I have spent 12 years hiding from the shame they forced onto me," I said, staring out at the glittering city lights, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. "They stole my grandmother's college fund. They stole my inheritance. They left me in a freezing storage unit to starve. And now they are trying to destroy the empire I built. I am not hiding anymore, David. Tomorrow night we open the doors, and we let them dig their own graves." The trap was fully set. The bait was laid out. The blinding arrogance of my parents was going to be their ultimate undoing. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a breathtaking sea of crystal chandeliers, bespoke tuxedos, and designer evening gowns. The air smelled of expensive champagne, roasted truffles, and the intoxicating, heavy scent of raw financial power. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant backdrop to the quiet murmurs of corporate titans negotiating deals worth millions. I stood near the main stage, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, holding a glass of sparkling water. To my right stood Victor, the billionaire CEO, a man whose mere presence commanded the absolute respect of the entire room. To my left stood David, holding a sleek black leather briefcase close to his side. "You have had a phenomenal year, Ethan," Victor said, clapping a heavy, fatherly hand on my shoulder. "That massive promotion you secured for your executive team last quarter, the aggressive new real estate acquisitions your firm managed. You are building a real legacy here in Chicago. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of the man you have become." "Thank you, Victor," I replied calmly, though my heart was beating a slow, steady, powerful rhythm of anticipation against my ribs. But building a lasting legacy requires cleaning out the rot first. Victor gave me a curious, analytical look, his brow furrowing slightly. But before he could ask what I meant by that, the heavy, ornate mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom violently burst open, crashing loudly against the walls. The low hum of elegant conversation instantly died. The string quartet screeched to a halt. Hundreds of heads turned toward the entrance in absolute shock. Standing in the doorway, looking entirely out of place and utterly desperate in their cheap, off-the-rack formal wear, were Robert and Susan. Flanking them was Uncle Mark, looking incredibly nervous and sweating profusely. And standing slightly behind them was Sophia, my corporate rival, wearing a stunning emerald gown and a smug, triumphant smile. Sophia had clearly used her VIP access and corporate influence to bypass the hotel security detail and smuggle my parents into the private event. Robert did not waste a single second. He spotted me standing near the stage and immediately began marching through the crowd of elite guests, shouting at the top of his lungs, completely destroying the decorum of the evening. "There he is," Robert bellowed, his face turning a dangerous, mottled shade of purple. "The great CEO, the self-made man. Look at him, ladies and gentlemen. Look at him living in absolute luxury, while the mother who gave him life is facing eviction. He is a fraud. He is a cruel, ungrateful, vicious son who abandoned his family when we needed him most." Susan immediately began her theatrical weeping, collapsing slightly against Uncle Mark's shoulder, burying her face in her hands, ensuring every wealthy investor in the room saw her tears. The elite guests stepped back, murmuring in shock and disgust, forming a wide, empty circle around the front of the stage. Sophia stood near the back of the crowd, pulling out her smartphone, clearly intending to record my public humiliation to leak to the trade press the next morning. Victor stepped forward, his eyes narrowing with furious authority. He reached into his jacket pocket. "Security, remove these people from my event immediately." "No, Victor," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension like a steel blade. I placed my hand gently over his to stop him. "Let him speak." The security guards hesitated, hovering uncertainly at the edges of the circle. Robert, emboldened by my apparent surrender and assuming I was terrified of a public scene, stepped right up to the edge of the stage. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. "You think you are better than us because you have money in the bank?" Robert spat, the venom in his voice echoing in the silent ballroom. "You owe us your life. We fed you, we clothed you, we raised you for 17 years. And when we hit a little financial trouble, you turn your back on us. You file a bogus restraining order against your own sick mother? You are human garbage, Ethan. If these prestigious people knew the real you, they would never do business with your firm again. Now, you are going to write us a check for $50,000 tonight to help your family, or I will stand here and tell every single person in this room exactly what a monster you are." He crossed his arms over his chest, breathing heavily, looking incredibly satisfied with his extortion attempt. He thought he had won. He thought the fear of corporate embarrassment and losing my high salary had paralyzed me. He thought I was still that helpless 17-year-old boy. I did not flinch. I did not yell. I did not try to defend myself. I simply turned my head and looked at David. David smiled. It was a cold, terrifying, purely predatory smile. He placed the black leather briefcase flat on a high-top cocktail table, unclipped the brass locks with a sharp click, and pulled out a thick stack of legally certified, watermarked financial documents. He didn't hand them to me. He handed them directly to Victor. "What is this?" Victor asked, frowning deeply as he adjusted his glasses and looked at the top page. "That, Victor," David said, his voice projecting clearly and flawlessly across the silent ballroom, ensuring every CEO and investor heard every word, "is the documented, irrefutable proof of a Class II federal felony." I stepped to the very edge of the stage, looking down at my father. The arrogant smirk on Robert's face began to falter, replaced by a sudden, creeping confusion. "12 years ago," I said, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers, calm, steady, and utterly lethal. "When I was 17 years old, working for minimum wage at a local grocery store, you didn't just pack up the house and move 2 states away. You didn't leave because you were facing bankruptcy or hard times." I pointed a steady finger at the documents in Victor's hands. "Shortly after my grandmother's funeral, she left a substantial inheritance and a massive college fund strictly in my name. Because I was a minor, you and Susan were the legal custodians of that trust. 2 months before you abandoned me in an empty house with a yellow post-it note telling me to figure it out, you forged legal documents and liquidated the entire account. Exactly $80,000 in cash." The entire ballroom drew a collective, horrified breath. "You stole your own son's future," I continued, my voice rising slightly, hammering the truth into him. "You stole it to pay off your illegal gambling debts and buy a commercial real estate property out of state. You left me to sleep in a freezing concrete storage unit and eat peanut butter out of the garbage while you bought a new house with my inheritance." Sophia's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. She lowered her phone, realizing with absolute horror that she had just publicly aligned herself with felons in front of the most powerful people in the industry. "That's a lie," Robert screamed, but his voice cracked horribly. Sweat was pouring profusely down his forehead. "Those documents are fake. He's lying to save his reputation. They are certified bank records, subpoenaed directly from the Federal Reserve just yesterday." "Robert," David stated loudly, crossing his arms. "And the absolute best part? The notary signature authorizing the fraudulent transfer, the signature that proves the conspiracy, belongs to your brother, Mark." Uncle Mark let out a choked, desperate gasp. He stumbled backward, his face draining of all blood, and dropped his crystal champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sharp, violent sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent room. Mark knew the law. He knew the statute of limitations on federal bank fraud involving a minor had not expired. He knew he was going to federal prison. Susan completely stopped her fake crying. She dropped her tissue. She looked at Robert in absolute, unadulterated terror. The mask had completely slipped. The victim narrative they had spent 12 years perfecting was annihilated in 60 seconds. They were exposed, naked and defenseless in front of the entire world. Victor, having finished reading the final page of the document, looked up. His eyes, usually warm and mentor-like, were now black with absolute disgust and fury. He looked at Robert not as a human being but as a disease. "In my world," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute, terrified silence. "We play hardball. We fight for market share. We are ruthless in business. But a man who steals his own child's college fund, a man who leaves his teenage son homeless to cover a gambling debt, that is not a man. That is a parasite. And I do not allow parasites in my ballroom." Victor snapped his fingers. The head of hotel security, accompanied by 3 uniformed Chicago police officers, pushed forcefully through the crowd. David had called them 30 minutes before my parents even arrived. "Officers," David said smoothly, pulling a folded piece of paper from his inner jacket pocket. "These 3 individuals are currently in direct, intentional violation of a court-mandated, 3-year restraining order protecting my client. They were legally served the paperwork on Monday. Furthermore, they are attempting to extort money. I demand their immediate arrest." "No, wait. Ethan, please," Susan shrieked, her voice shrill and utterly desperate as a police officer firmly grabbed her arm, spun her around, and pulled her hands behind her back. "We're your parents. You can't do this. We love you. Ethan, stop them. You love the money, Susan," I said, looking down at her from the stage as the heavy metal handcuffs clicked loudly around her wrists. "You never loved me." Robert tried to pull away from the officers, swearing violently, kicking at the air, his face completely red. It took 2 heavily built cops to wrestle him to the floor and force him into cuffs. He looked like a wild, pathetic animal. Uncle Mark didn't fight at all. He just held his hands out, weeping silently, knowing his comfortable life was completely ruined by his own greed. The elite crowd watched in stunned, breathless silence as my biological parents and my uncle were frog-marched out of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom in handcuffs. Their cheap evening wear rumpled, their dignity entirely shredded. I turned my gaze to Sophia, who was trying to quietly and desperately slip out the side door. "Sophia," I called out. She froze instantly, her back stiffening. "I have already forwarded the security footage of you smuggling them in here to the ethics board of your parent company. Expect a massive lawsuit for corporate sabotage, harassment, and defamation on your desk by Monday morning." Sophia looked like she was going to be physically sick. She practically ran out the door, her career entirely over. I turned back to Victor. He handed the documents back to David, then looked at me with a profound, newfound respect. He picked up 2 fresh glasses of champagne from a passing waiter and handed one to me. "To taking out the trash," Victor said quietly. "To taking out the trash," I replied, clinking my crystal glass against his. I took a slow sip, tasted like absolute, unparalleled freedom. The fallout from the charity gala was incredibly swift, utterly brutal, and entirely merciless. By Tuesday morning, the corporate world had completely devoured Sophia. Her parent company, absolutely terrified of the massive defamation and corporate sabotage lawsuit David had drafted over the weekend, immediately terminated her contract without a second thought. She was unceremoniously stripped of her CEO title, lost her golden parachute severance package, and was essentially blacklisted from the tech consulting industry anywhere in the Midwest. She packed up her office in a cardboard box and vanished. Uncle Mark's fate was even worse. He was facing severe federal charges for notary fraud, wire fraud, and financial conspiracy against a minor. Because he was a coward terrified of dying in a federal penitentiary, he immediately took a plea deal and flipped on my parents. He handed over every email, every text message, and every bank receipt detailing exactly how they had meticulously planned the theft of my inheritance 12 years ago. He provided the prosecution with the nail in my parents' coffin. Robert and Susan spent the entire weekend in the county jail for violating the restraining order, because they were now facing massive civil litigation for me to recoup the stolen $80,000, plus a decade of compound interest, legal fees, and punitive damages. Their bank accounts were instantly frozen. They couldn't post bail. They had to sit in a cold cell in their formal wear until Monday morning. When they were finally released on their own recognizance pending trial, they returned to their home state only to find an absolute nightmare waiting for them. The IRS, tipped off by David's aggressive forensic accounting, had audited their shell corporation and placed a massive tax lien on their investment real estate. The bank foreclosed on their primary residence. They lost the house. They lost their leased cars. They were forced to pack whatever they could carry into garbage bags, a poetic irony, and move into a crumbling, low-income apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of their town. They had spent 12 years pretending to be wealthy, heartbroken victims, and now they were simply broke, exposed criminals facing federal prison time. I didn't feel a single drop of pity for them. They were finally reaping the exact, devastating harvest they had sown. A week after the gala, I was sitting in my penthouse apartment. The fireplace was crackling, casting a warm orange glow over the hardwood floors. The doorbell rang. It was Oliver. He walked in looking entirely exhausted, carrying a heavy bottle of expensive whiskey in a paper bag. He took off his winter coat, draped it over a chair, and slumped onto my velvet sofa. I went to the kitchen, grabbed 2 heavy crystal glasses, and sat down across from him. He poured the amber liquid in silence, handing me a glass. Chloe filed the final paperwork for full custody today, just to establish a legal barrier to protect Leo from them, Oliver said, staring blankly into his glass. My parents called me yesterday from a prepaid burner phone. They were crying. They begged me to send them money for groceries. They told me I was their only hope, that they were going to starve. I took a slow sip of the whiskey. It burned pleasantly down my throat, grounding me in the present moment. And what did you say to them? Oliver looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a profound, lingering grief. I hung up. I didn't say a word. I blocked the number. I finally changed my phone plan so they can't track it. I cut the cord, Ethan. Completely. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands. He took a shuddering breath. Ethan, I am so deeply, incredibly sorry. For all of it. For being a coward when we were kids. For letting Dad bully me into submission. For finding your LinkedIn and being too terrified of losing my allowance and my comfortable salary to send you a simple message asking if you were alive. I sat in a warm dorm room eating pizza while you were sleeping in a freezing storage unit. I will never, ever forgive myself for that weakness. I looked at my older brother. For 12 long years, I had held onto a burning, toxic resentment toward him. I had viewed him as the golden child, the complicit partner in my suffering, the one who reaped the benefits of my stolen college fund. But seeing him now, a man desperately trying to break the heavy chains of decades of psychological abuse, a father terrified of repeating the cycle of manipulation with his own son, I realized something incredibly important. Oliver was a victim, too. Robert and Susan didn't just abuse me by neglecting me and stealing from me. They abused Oliver by weaponizing his comfort. They tied his survival to his total obedience. They made him a hostage in a gilded cage. He was weak, yes. He was cowardly, absolutely. But he was not evil. He was just a traumatized kid who had finally found the courage to break the cycle and protect his own child. Oliver, I said softly, setting my glass down on the heavy oak coffee table. He looked up, his face stained with tears. You were 15 when the psychological abuse really started. You were 19 when they left. You were a kid trying to survive a toxic, volatile household just like I was. You chose the path of least resistance because you were terrified of the consequences. I get it. I leaned forward, looking him directly and intensely in the eyes. I don't need you to live in guilt for the rest of your life. That doesn't serve either of us. I need you to be a good husband to Chloe. I need you to be a good father to Leo so he never has to know what it feels like to be afraid of the people who are supposed to protect him. Do you understand me? Oliver nodded rapidly, wiping his eyes aggressively with the back of his hand, letting out a heavy, shuddering breath that sounded like years of pressure leaving his lungs. I will. I swear to God, Ethan, I will. Good, I said, picking my glass back up and raising it slightly. Then we are done talking about the past. Welcome to the family, Oliver. We sat there for hours, drinking whiskey as the snow began to fall outside the massive windows. We talked about his new job prospects, we talked about Leo's upcoming birthday, we talked about everything except the two people who had tried to destroy us. For the first time in my entire life, I actually had a brother. 6 months passed. The brutal, cold Chicago winter slowly melted into a bright, vibrant spring. The civil lawsuit against my parents was finalized. David relentlessly seized their remaining assets, recovering the $80,000 they stole from my college fund, plus significant interest. I didn't need the money. I had a massive salary and a thriving business. I donated every single penny of that recovered money to a local charity in Chicago that provides emergency housing and scholarships for homeless teenagers. It felt like the perfect, poetic closing of a deeply painful circle. I took the weapon they used to destroy my youth and used it to save someone else's. One Tuesday afternoon, David's office forwarded a piece of physical mail to my apartment. It was a standard, cheap white envelope. The return address was a P.O. box from the rundown, impoverished town my parents were now living in. I sat at my massive kitchen island, holding the envelope in my hands. A year ago, seeing my mother's handwriting would have triggered a severe panic attack. My chest would have tightened. My hands would have shaken. Today, my heart rate didn't even spike. I slid a butter knife under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. It was from Susan. Ethan, we have absolutely nothing left. Your father's health is failing, and we are struggling to survive every single day. I know you hate us. I know you will never speak to us again. But I need you to know that in the quiet moments, when the anger fades, I finally realize what we did. We were drowning in debt, and we made a horrific choice to sacrifice you to save ourselves. We failed as parents. We failed as human beings. We will not contact you again. I am sorry. There were no demands for money this time. There were no manipulative guilt trips about family obligations. There were no empty threats of lawsuits or public embarrassment. It was just the pathetic, hollow confession of a woman who had finally hit rock bottom and realized that the narrative she had spun for 12 years had entirely, permanently collapsed. I read the letter twice, analyzing every word. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I certainly didn't feel the urge to call her and offer forgiveness. Forgiveness is for people who are actively trying to repair the damage they caused, not for people who only apologize when they are entirely out of ammunition and options. What I felt was absolute, profound indifference. They were ghosts to me now. They were strangers I used to know in another lifetime, characters in a horror story I had already survived and closed the book on. I walked over to the kitchen trash can, tore the letter directly in half, and let the pieces fall in with the coffee grounds and eggshells. I washed my hands with warm water, dried them on a towel, and walked into my living room, where the real world was waiting for me. My apartment was a chaotic, beautiful explosion of color and noise. Helium balloons in bright primary colors were floating against the high ceiling. A massive banner reading, "Happy 4th Birthday, Leo," was strung across the floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the Chicago skyline. On the velvet sofa, Chloe was laughing, helping Leo unwrap a massive box of wooden building blocks. Oliver was in the kitchen, attempting to slice a massive chocolate dinosaur cake without making a mess, arguing playfully with Sarah, the diner owner who had saved my life 12 years ago, whom I had flown in first class specifically for the party. David, my ruthless, shark-like lawyer, was sitting in a corner armchair, surprisingly allowing Leo to stick a bright green dinosaur sticker directly onto the lapel of his expensive, custom-tailored suit. I stood in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe, just watching them. I thought about that freezing Tuesday afternoon 12 years ago. I thought about the empty, echoing house. I thought about the yellow post-it note sitting on the bear counter. You'll figure it out. They meant it as a harsh dismissal. They meant it as a cruel joke to a boy they assumed would fail, end up in jail, or worse. They threw me to the wolves, hoping the wolves would handle the problem so they could live comfortably on my stolen inheritance. But they were wrong. I did figure it out. I figured out how to survive on generic peanut butter and pure, unadulterated spite. I figured out how to build a corporate empire from absolute scratch. But more importantly, through all the pain and the betrayal, I figured out that blood does not make a family. Hitting the genetic lottery and sharing DNA with someone does not give them a lifelong, irrevocable license to abuse you, steal from you, and manipulate your emotions. Family is not a biological obligation you are forced to endure. Family is a choice. Family is the woman in a diner who feeds a starving teenager at 2 a.m. Family is the brother who finally finds the courage to stand up to his abusers and break the cycle of generational trauma. Family is the sister-in-law who risks everything, including her own safety, to bring you the truth. Family is the people who choose to sit in your living room and celebrate life with you, simply because they love you, without any conditions or hidden agendas. I walked into the living room. Leo saw me, dropped his blocks, and sprinted across the hardwood floor, his little feet slapping against the wood. "Uncle Ethan!" he yelled, crashing into my legs. I scooped him up, spinning him around in the air until he squealed with pure, unfiltered laughter. Chloe smiled at me from the couch, a warm, genuine smile of total peace and gratitude. Oliver walked over and handed me a massive slice of chocolate cake. I was 29 years old. I was a self-made man. I had survived the absolute worst they could throw at me, and for the first time in my entire life, standing in a room full of noise, laughter, and love, I was exactly where I belonged. I was home. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard line and cut off the people who were supposed to protect you? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Remember, you are not defined by the people who abandoned you. You are defined by the life you choose to build afterward. Stay strong.